Welcome to this video on the oligarchs of Russia and their relationship to the Russian state. In this video, we'll explore who the oligarchs are, their relationship to Putin, and how they've impacted Russia's economy and politics. During the annexation of Crimea and the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine, Putin's government has been accused of using funds from oligarchs to finance its military operations. Oligarchs, who are wealthy individuals with significant political influence in Russia, have been accused of providing financial support to the Russian government to carry out these military actions. In fact, on the day that Russia attacked Ukraine, there was a meeting in the Kremlin between Putin and a group of influential oligarchs. It is reported that at this meeting, Putin called on these oligarchs to assist the government with its special operation in Ukraine. This meeting took place on February 28, 2014, just one day after the ousting of Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. Some of the oligarchs that attended the meeting were known to have close ties to Putin's government and the Russian military. They were reportedly asked to use their wealth and resources to provide support for the Russian military's operations in Ukraine. It is worth noting that not all oligarchs in Russia are supportive of Putin's military actions in Ukraine. Some have expressed opposition or criticized the government's actions. However, those who do support the government's actions are believed to have provided significant financial support to the military effort. Overall, it is widely believed that Putin's government has relied on oligarchs and their resources to finance its military operations in Ukraine. The exact amount of financial support provided by oligarchs is unknown, but it is thought to have played a significant role in the conflict. The war in Ukraine has strained the relationship between the oligarchs and Putin's regime. As Russia's involvement in the conflict increased, the oligarchs were called upon to support the government's special operation in Ukraine. This resulted in increased financial support from the oligarchs to the government, which enabled Putin to finance the war effort. However, as the conflict continued, the oligarchs themselves became targets of international sanctions, as the West sought to punish Russia for its actions in Ukraine. The good and luxurious lives that the oligarchs had enjoyed were now in danger, as their assets and investments abroad were frozen, and they were restricted from traveling to Western countries. Despite this, many of the oligarchs remain convinced that they earned their wealth through their own merit and hard work. They do not see that their wealth is largely the result of the connections they have to Putin's regime, which has allowed them to amass vast fortunes through dubious means. As the sanctions continue to bite, some of the oligarchs may be forced to reevaluate their relationship with Putin and his regime. They may come to realize that their fortunes are directly tied to Putin's actions and policies, and that continuing to support him could ultimately lead to their downfall. The oligarchs in Russia are a group of extremely wealthy individuals who hold a lot of power and influence in the country. Many of them were born and raised during the Soviet Union era, and therefore have a certain nostalgia and affinity towards that time period. This is evidenced by interviews given by some of these oligarchs to journalists. During the 1990s, Russia was going through a period of extreme economic instability, with high unemployment rates, corruption, and a lack of basic necessities like food and shelter. It was during this time that the oligarchs came to power. They took advantage of the chaos and instability to accumulate vast amounts of wealth and power, primarily through privatization of state-owned enterprises. In the early 1990s, the Russian government led by Boris Yeltsin began the process of privatizing state-owned companies and industries, including energy, telecommunications, and transportation. The idea behind privatization was to shift ownership from the state to the private sector in order to stimulate competition, increase efficiency, and spur economic growth. To achieve this, the government issued vouchers to Russian citizens that could be exchanged for shares in these newly privatized companies. However, many ordinary Russians, who were struggling to make ends meet in the face of economic chaos, corruption, and high unemployment, were more concerned with selling their vouchers for cash to buy basic necessities like food and shelter. This opened the door for savvy businessmen who had access to capital to buy up these vouchers at discounted prices and acquire a significant share of the newly privatized companies. These businessmen later became known as oligarchs and quickly amassed enormous wealth and power, becoming key players in the Russian economy and political landscape. The voucher privatization program, however, was widely criticized for its flawed implementation and the transfer of assets to a small group of well-connected individuals at the expense of ordinary citizens. This gave rise to a growing wealth gap in Russia, where a small group of oligarchs controlled a significant portion of the country's resources and political power while many Russians continued to struggle. It is worth noting that the voucher privatization program was not unique to Russia and was used in several other countries transitioning from state control to market-based economies in the 1990s. However, in Russia, the program had a profound impact on the country's economic and political development, creating a new class of ultra-rich businessmen who wielded significant influence in the halls of power. During the privatization process in the 1990s, individuals such as Michael Chodorkowski and Boris Beresovsky took advantage of the situation by purchasing shares of state-owned companies that were being sold off to the public. Chodorkowski, a former chemist, focused on the oil industry and acquired control over a large part of it. Meanwhile, Beresovsky made his fortune in the automobile industry, and others benefited from construction contracts with the government. As these individuals gained wealth and power, they began to exert more influence over politics, using their financial resources to sway political outcomes and even bring down governments that they did not agree with. Their control over certain industries and their connections to government officials allowed them to shape policies in their favor and gain even more wealth and influence. This concentration of power and wealth in the hands of a few individuals became a significant issue in Russian politics and ultimately led to Putin's crackdown on the oligarchs. After coming into power, Putin started to consolidate his control over the country and weaken the influence of the oligarchs. He did this by attacking the oligarchs who were not acting in his favor or posed a threat to his power. Michael Chodorkowski, who had gained control over a large part of the oil industry, was one such oligarch. He was arrested and sent to a labor camp for almost a decade after he criticized corruption, which Putin did not like, even though it was not necessarily directed at him. Similarly, media magnate Vladimir Gusinsky was pressured by the Kremlin so hard that he left Russia and now lives in exile. Boris Beresovsky, who had made a fortune from the automobile industry and had gained control over politics, was found dead, hanging in his home. These actions demonstrate that Putin sees the oligarchs as a threat to his power and control over the country. Putin believes that the oligarchs are only rich because of his regime and that their wealth and power must be kept in check. By eliminating those oligarchs who pose a threat to him and his government, Putin has been able to maintain his grip on power and control the direction of the country. Under Putin's regime, many of the privatized companies went back into state ownership, which has allowed Putin to consolidate his control over the country and shift power away from the oligarchs. These companies are now run by Putin's close circle under the ownership of the government. This move was crucial for Putin's aim to refocus power on himself and his government. Russia is one of the largest producers of oil and gas in the world, and as a result, these industries make up a significant portion of the country's GDP. In fact, it's estimated that around 40% of the Russian economy is directly tied to oil and gas production. This has been a major source of revenue for the Russian government and has allowed them to invest heavily in other areas such as defense, infrastructure, and social programs. However, this reliance on oil and gas also gives Russia significant geopolitical leverage. Countries that are heavily dependent on Russian oil and gas, such as Germany, are vulnerable to supply disruptions or price increases. This can be used by the Kremlin as a political tool to influence foreign policy or gain concessions from other countries. For example, during the 2014 Ukraine crisis, Russia used the threat of cutting off gas supplies to Ukraine as a way to pressure the Ukrainian government and its allies in Europe. Overall, the importance of oil and gas to the Russian economy and its geopolitical power cannot be overstated. It remains a key strategic asset for the Kremlin and a major factor in its relationships with other countries. I hope you enjoyed learning about the relationship between Putin and the oligarchs and how it has impacted Russia's politics and economy. If you want to dive deeper into this topic, feel free to let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you and explore this topic further in future videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.